They have a lot of personality, really wonderful birds to see. We're fortunate to have them nesting in Maine now. That wasn't always the case. And we're lucky we get to see them around from late May to the middle of August or so is their breeding season in Maine. And they can be reliably seen from boats out on some of the islands where they nest. And there are 5 islands in Maine now where puffins nest. I'll touch on some other seabirds in the talk today as well. Of course, this is an albatross. This is a Lyons albatross nesting on Midway Atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And this particular bird is quite famous. I don't know if anyone might know, but this bird's very affectionately known as Wisdom, and it is a female albatross, and she actually happens to be the oldest known living wild bird. She's at least 69 years old this year. She could be a little bit older. We don't know. She was first banded as a young adult when she came back to Midway to breed for the first time. That was in 1956, I believe. And she's carried a band ever since so that she could be identified. That band's been changed 2 or 3 times to make sure it was still readable. She could be even older because albatross don't nest right away. They usually wait until they're somewhere between 5 and 10 years old. So that estimate of her being 69 was based on her potentially coming back as a 5-year-old to nest for the first time. If she took a little bit more time to come back than that, she could be well into her 70s now. But truly an amazing bird. She has a big following. A lot of people tune in every year to make sure she's arrived back at Midway Island or Midway Atoll, and that she successfully raises a chick. He's doing really well, and it is raising chicks pretty reliably, even into her late 60s now. An interesting aspect of seabirds is that they are almost always colonial, nesting in colonies that are sometimes quite large. This photo here on the left shows a king penguin colony in South Georgia. King penguins are really beautiful penguins. The photo on the right shows a male and female in a courtship behavior or courtship ritual. The photo on the left, you can see a lot of brown birds. Well, those are chicks that are getting nearly old enough to move out and become independent and leave the colony to go fishing for themselves. But penguins are certainly an example, a great example of seabirds. They only come to land to nest and spend the rest of their time in the water or at sea. Most seabirds are flying. Penguins are swimming, of course. But a great example of just how social seabirds can be and tend to be, and that'll be an important part of their behavioral makeup that we'll see can play an important role in their conservation. This photo shows another aspect of seabird behavior, and that's looking for food. This is a double-crested cormorant off the west coast of North America, and it's chasing a group of fish, just hoping to catch 1 or 2 of the stragglers in that group. And it's a really neat example of a diving seabird, and shows us how seabirds exist in a whole variety of environments. They're actually champions of catching fish underwater, or many species are. They're also, often very accomplished flyers in the air. And then, of course, they nest on land. So they're really masters of the land, the air, and the sea, which is pretty unusual to find in a single organism. Really a neat aspect of seabirds is just how diverse, how flexible, how adaptable they are to our Earth. And I mentioned that they're often master flyers. This is a magnificent frigate bird. You can often see these in the southern U.S., the Gulf states, the Gulf of Mexico in general, but also in other places in pretty semi-tropical latitudes generally. But these birds are expert flyers. They actually don't ever settle on the surface of the water or dive underwater. Their feathers are not waterproof. So if they do hit the water, they become waterlogged and have a very difficult time getting airborne again. So they spend all of their time in the air when they're not at land nesting. So this bird, this species, can spend months flying without ever setting down on anything. And they do that in a really amazing way. They're able to shut off parts of their brain and let those parts sleep while just enough of their brain is active to keep them in flight. A pretty amazing adaptation to allow them to stay out of the water. They also have really interesting food habits. When they catch prey themselves, they catch it out of the water, actually. And so maybe some of you might guess what their favorite prey item is. Well, it's flying fish, as you might expect, a fish that's jumped out of the water. But they're also notorious pirates. They're very good, in part because they're such excellent flyers, at hassling other birds, large and small, and not leaving them alone until those birds either drop the fish they're carrying or even throw up a little bit of food, which the frigate bird will catch in the air before it hits the water. So really an amazingly adapted species for life at sea, even though it's not in the sea. It's always above it. Seabirds, though, have experienced significant declines over recent decades. This graph in the lower left of this slide shows some of the monitored populations around the world and the significant declines, averaging around 70% decline for monitored populations around the world. The photo here is of a couple breeding marbled murrelets. These are birds that have experienced really dramatic declines on our U.S. West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. And so there's a lot of concern for seabirds, a lot of conservation need. And I'll go into a few of the reasons seabird populations have declined, both historical and current challenges for seabirds. Historically, one of the biggest challenges was just that seabirds were hunted in many cases. You can see in the center photo there, that's actually a place in Iceland where there is still a hunt of Atlantic puffins, a small-scale hunt using long-handled nets. In the lower left is a drawing of a great auk. I only have a drawing because great auks are now extinct because of hunting pressure from sailors crossing the North Atlantic. They were the largest species of bird in the alcid family, the same family as puffins. And they were as big as penguins and as some of the larger penguins, and flightless also, which made them very easy to catch when they were on their nesting islands and harvest for meat. That photo on the right, it doesn't show a hunter, it shows the purchaser of a hunted bird. In the late 1800s, it was very fashionable for women to wear hats, large hats, and it became fashionable for them to mount birds or parts of birds, at least the feathers, on those hats. And that led to some significant levels of hunting that really caused the collapse of many populations, especially populations that nested colonially in places where they were easily found, reliably found, and could be harvested in large numbers. So that millinery trade, as we call it now, resulted in significant bird declines, and in the United States led to the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, a treaty that we signed with Great Britain and later with other countries. Great Britain was representing Canada at the time. And that has led to significant protections for birds here in the U.S. and our treaty nations, the nations we've signed treaties with. Another very serious problem historically that persists even to the modern day is invasive species. And this takes the form of rats, mice, cats, pigs, goats, and other species that we've introduced to islands where seabirds historically nested in safety and isolation. These photos show, the photo on the left there shows a mouse on the head of an adult albatross that's sitting on its egg. And that albatross won't leave its egg and won't even tend to its own needs or its own protection from that mouse. And so you can see on the right, some mice are free to inflict pretty serious injuries to birds this way. This is kind of a graphic example, but there are even more graphic examples with larger mammals like rats, cats, and other things. This has been a serious problem, especially on the more remote islands where seabirds nest. In coastal areas where there are a lot of people, one way we challenge a lot of seabirds is by subsidizing certain native species. And that often takes the form of the local gull population, whichever species of gull that might be. In Maine, that was herring gulls. And many of the seabird islands became completely dominated and totally taken over by gulls, in part because we subsidized gulls so much. That top photo there shows a landfill and a large number of gulls that are getting a real food subsidy from things we're casting away, throwing away. And this tipping of the balance towards gulls that we've introduced has been a problem in areas close to us, particularly coastal islands on the margin of continents where lots of people live. We do some other things that are very hard on seabird populations. Some of our fishing techniques around the world experience or induce a lot of bycatch. Longline fishing is one technique in particular where fishermen essentially dangle a line that is miles long into the water with thousands of hooks connected to that line. Each hook with a small fish as bait, and seabirds trailing a boat that's dragging these lines quickly recognize that there is fish getting thrown into the water, and will attempt to catch those fish, become hooked, and then drowned as the line moves underwater. This is only one way in which fisheries can impact seabirds. There are measures that fishermen can take, and in some parts of the world, such as here in the U.S., fishermen are quite careful to avoid this using streamer lines that scare the birds far enough away from the boat that the bait is too deep in the water for them to reach before they have access to it. There are parts of the world, however, where those practices are not required, are not regulated, And so there's still significant loss to seabirds in those areas. A growing problem in our world, as I'm sure many of you recognize, is the problem of pollution. And the photos I've shown are in particular plastic pollution. This can be something that seabirds can mistake as food. They can pick it up off the surface of the ocean as it's floating around, and then bring it back, as this Lyons albatross did, to feed its chick. And the chick's stomachs can become so full of plastic that they can't ingest real food, so they end up starving. So this is not a huge fraction of birds at this time, but it's a growing problem, something we're definitely concerned about. And then finally, as I'm sure most folks on the call are aware, climate change is having a big impact on our environment in many ways. And one way that seabirds are impacted is by the loss of low-lying sandy islands. In the lower right here, you can see a former island just off the South Carolina coast, actually, where brown pelicans nested in large numbers. That upper right photo shows the nesting colony before there was a significant storm-induced erosion of the island. And that bottom photo, you can just see a few birds in a dark line across a skinny island. It's been greatly impacted by storms that are more intense now because of warm ocean temperatures. So seabirds have a lot of challenges, and a lot of those challenges are the fault of us, of people. But I don't want to leave you with that. I want you to appreciate that when we put our minds to it, we can make a difference for seabirds and for any other type of wildlife. And that's really the story I want to share with you today, is that even the actions of just one very passionate person can make a huge difference. And the person I'm going to talk about a little bit today and then kind of talk about some of the long-term benefits is Steve Kress. We've already mentioned him. He founded our program within Audubon in coastal Maine. He named it Project Puffin because his initial interest was to restore puffins, Atlantic puffins, to Maine, the coast of Maine, where they were almost completely lost. And he did that by going north to a colony in Canada, in Newfoundland, that was still relatively healthy and large, and taking chicks out of burrows. Puffins nest underground in burrows or in rocky crevices. And so he got permission to bring a small number of chicks, pufflings, as we know them, from Canada down to the coast of Maine, where he released them in burrows that he and a team had built. And there they artificially reared or raised those pufflings by giving them fish to eat, their normal prey, small fish, bait fish, and delivering those to the mouth of the burrow. When an adult puffin feeds chicks, it will carry a load of fish in its bill back into the burrow and just drop them on the floor of the burrow. And then the chick will pick them up and eat them, grow up to be nearly adult size, and look like the puffin in the photo on the right here. That's a puffin that's completely grown and is departing its birthplace, that burrow behind it, and it's making its way off the island. It will walk to the shore and then jump in the water and swim away. It is capable of flight at this age, but typically their first voyage is by sea, not by air. And puffins are interesting. They're completely independent when they leave the burrow. They never interact with their parents again. They're not trained to catch fish. They know how to do that innately. So a really neat lifestyle. I know many parents, many human parents, probably wish their children became independent so abruptly or reliably, but that's the way puffins do it. And they display a remarkable fidelity or faithfulness to the island where they were raised. That's really where they look to come back to nest. And puffins, much like the albatross I mentioned earlier, take a few years to develop, to become good at catching fish, to become good at figuring out how to interact with the opposite sex. And so they typically don't nest until they're 4 or 5 either. That's true of a lot of seabirds, and especially the longer-lived seabirds. So when Project Puffin had raised actually 1,000 chicks at Eastern Egg Rock, that first island where puffin restoration began, they waited for several years for some of those pufflings to return as adults, and they weren't coming back. It seemed like there should have been pufflings old enough to come back and start nesting, but they weren't coming ashore. And so it occurred to Steve to maybe show them that there were some puffins there, that it would be safe for puffins to come ashore on the island. And so he created some decoys, set out some mirror boxes so puffins could see themselves, actually. And very quickly after doing that, after offering that social attraction, if you will, real live adult puffins started coming ashore. And it wasn't long until they started nesting. You can see on the left there's a few decoys and a few live birds in that photo. You may have to look close to tell them apart, but live birds have 2 legs and the decoys just have 1. That is a helpful hint on how to tell them apart. And they waited as puffins were landing on the island, not knowing if birds were nesting, if they had crawled down into a crevice and laid an egg or not, until they saw a bird returning carrying fish in its bill, like this bird at the right. And that's a sure sign that that bird has a chick and is going to feed that chick. And that first bird delivering fish actually came in on July 4th, 1980. And so this year we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the first puffins returning to Eastern Egg Rock. Audubon now manages with partners, state and federal partners, a Seabird Island sanctuary network. The work has grown from Eastern Egg Rock, which is kind of in the middle of that map, and near the Project Puffin summer office, which is right at Hog Island, and added to that island 6 others, 2 of which are now puffin islands. The other 4 have a variety of other species of seabirds, especially terns. And so that initial effort to restore one species to one island has grown in a variety of ways, both to other islands and other species. Managing a sanctuary network does take regular attention. That's something we're very focused on even today, 40 years later, because seabirds have an array of predators. And in normal circumstances, these seabirds could tolerate predators, but in our modern day, we've given them so few islands, and in Maine, for example, some of the most rare species, puffins, some of the rare terns, would have very little opportunity to breed elsewhere, So when predators find them at these places, we do our best to shoo them away. What we can do is have people live on the islands. We have young biologists spend the summer living with seabirds. And just their presence deters most predator species, certainly keeps eagles away, slows down the peregrine falcons, shown on a turn there on the left. And those island interns, we call them, can also catch great horned owls for us to relocate to places where far inland where they won't bother seabirds, or American mink, which can swim out to seabird islands that are near the mainland coast. There's also the issue of vegetation growth. And this is actually an unappreciated aspect of climate change. In coastal Maine, we're getting much more rain than used to fall during the summer. And that supports more vegetation growth. Certainly having a bunch of seabirds on an island depositing their guano on the island provides excellent fertilizer, and that also stimulates vegetation growth. So one regular maintenance activity we have is limiting vegetation growth through the use of weed barriers, and also offering nest boxes for the species that prefer them. Roseate terns in particular like to nest under cover. Their chicks like to hide out, and so often take to nest boxes like that when shown quite well. So another aspect of seabird conservation, and in Maine and really around the world, cleaning up some of the human debris that enters the marine environment. We know it as marine debris. It is another regular task. And we actually, in Maine, see a lot of washed up lobster traps on our seabird islands. And we work with lobster fishermen, such as the owner of this boat, to remove that debris from seabird islands and take it to be recycled or disposed of as appropriate. But kind of ongoing work that's important to keep habitat in good shape for seabirds. But probably one of the most important legacies of our program, or what we're doing every year that may have the most impact down the road, is we're recruiting help. And these photos show many of the young biologists that work with us each year. We typically work with anywhere from 25 to 50 young biologists per year, including some who come to us from international locations. The 4 folks on the right all come from Ecuador, Mexico, and China, actually. So we're training people both to be conservationists in the US, but also around the world. And we're training them on seabird restoration techniques and biological conservation in general. In addition to kind of planting people around the world, our program is also now producing conservation decoys for the social attraction that I mentioned. In these photos, our own Seabird Sue, an artist and biologist of great note, is painting tern decoys for use. These, I believe, went off to China for a project there. And in the lower right, there are northern gannet decoys for another project. So we now produce conservation materials for seabird projects around. And I'll just talk about a couple of those projects to give you an impression of what broad impact this work in Maine has had. And one of those, the first one that I'll mention, is for the Chinese crested tern. In China, this is often known as the bird of mystery or the bird of legend because it was thought to be extinct. For over 60 years, no one saw any of these birds. So it was commonly believed that they were gone. But it turns out that in the year 2000, at a small island off the coast of China, actually administered by Taiwan, a photographer noticed in his photos that there were a few birds that didn't look quite like the rest. There's a common species of tern there, the greater crested tern, and they have this gray back, and the top of their wings are kind of a darker gray. But what this photographer noticed was mixed in, there were some terns that had a white back, much lighter, very different, and a bill that had a little dark tip to it. And he didn't know what he was looking at initially, but after some research and talking to people, he realized that he had seen the bird of legend, this bird of mystery that had been thought to be extinct for over 60 years. That's the Chinese crested tern. So once that discovery was made, conservationists in China, biologists, became very interested in trying to recover this species. And with some help from folks, including myself, based here in the US and elsewhere in Asia, there were multiple conservation projects started. You can see this photo in the left here has a couple of decoys set out, and there are birds that are settled in around those decoys. And in really amazing fashion, this population has gone from a handful, less than 10 known, to now around 100 individuals. And there are 5 safe nesting areas that are protected, where social attraction techniques are bringing birds back. And that's an example of a pair with one of the most rare chicks in the world, a Chinese crested tern chick there beneath them. So a really amazing recovery story. Of course, with only around 100 individuals, this species still has a very long way to go before it's in a safe zone population-wise. But really amazing conservation has brought this bird back from the brink to a much safer place. The other example that I'll mention takes me back to Midway and the Lyons albatrosses there, where we saw wisdom nests. This is another photo of Midway, and what I want you to take from this is just how flat the island is and low-lying. This photo, unfortunately, doesn't capture the water, but Midway's an atoll, and there is no topography. There are no hills. They're very close to sea level here on this island. And the birds are at risk from storms, from rising sea levels, and the combination with climate change is beginning to erode their habitat. And people have done some modeling, some pretty high-tech mapping of the islands, and then predicting what sea level rise and more energetic storms and the waves associated with those storms will inundate. And you can see here the 3 main islands of Midway Atoll. And the shaded portions in blues and greens represent areas that'll be flooded at different levels of sea level rise. An appreciable amount happens even with just a half a meter, which is maybe 1.5 feet. But if it ends up being a 2-meter rise, or when it ends up being a 2-meter sea level rise, really significant parts of these islands will be gone, will be flooded regularly and not available as nesting habitat for the albatross here. Eastern Island in particular is problematic. The little dots don't represent individual nests. They represent centers of around 100 nests. The population is really large there, but a really big portion of the population is going to lose their nesting habitat. So a real significant concern. And albatross, much like puffins, are very faithful, very loyal to the island where they were born, where they hatched and were reared. So they don't typically find other places to nest very easy. It's a challenge for them, and that means it's a challenge for us. And so techniques that were developed for puffins are now being used for albatross. And this photo shows both Lyons albatross and black-footed albatross on the right, both of which nest on Midway Island. And these are small initial efforts to get these two species of albatross to nest in new places on the main islands of Hawaii. I believe both of these are on Oahu, but on the populated islands of Hawaii. So these have to be done in fenced areas that are protected from the various predators that exist on the main Hawaiian islands, but it involves moving chicks, like this black-footed albatross chick here in the front of the photo on the right, and then attracting adults back when there are birds of adult age ready to breed using decoys and recorded calls. So an example of how these social attraction techniques, first pioneered by Project Puffin in Maine, are benefiting species very far away that are subject to really significant threats as climate change becomes more of a challenge. And I wanted to share this slide to kind of wrap up. This is a map of all of the seabird restoration projects that we know about currently across the world. We're actually involved with partners trying to catalog all of the restoration projects that have happened. It's a big job to do this cataloging because the projects are so far afield now. The methods have become so standardized and successful and widely accepted that people we don't know, we've never met, we've never heard of, are using these techniques to help seabirds. As many as 94 species, even probably more than 94 species, have been helped. And that's really about a quarter of all the seabird species in the world. So this little project, started by one really passionate person in Maine, has now benefited around a quarter of all the seabird species in the world. Really an amazing story of impact that even one person can have. People can make a difference. So I wanted to leave you with a to-do list, a few things that you can do to help save the seabirds. At Audubon, we're constantly thinking about these kinds of things and what we can do. And so just a few things: defend bedrock environmental laws when they're challenged. One thing I didn't touch on much today, but it's really important to make sure that seabirds have enough food to eat, and they eat fish most often. So managing fish and fisheries is really important for seabirds. Advocating for action on climate change is, of course, critical for the future. Think of those albatross whenever you're, in a conversation with someone about climate change. And then just protecting wild places. And for seabirds, that means islands where they need to nest. Okay, that's all I wanted to share with you today. If you have an interest in getting more information, there's a couple website links there in the upper left. Just remember Project Puffin and Hog Island, and you can search for those websites. This is a photo of our property in Maine, the entrance to both our Hog Island camp and the office home of Project Puffin. And so I'll leave you with that, and hopefully we have some time for questions.
Wow, that was great, Don. Thank you so much for all that information. You have some, well, I mean, obviously you're never going to fill Steve's shoes, but it's just incredible the work that he has done for the planet, really. I mean, we're just so proud that that this work is continuing to go on. And before I get to the questions, I just wanted to mention too those last links that he put up about Hog Island Camp. You can go and go to a variety. Hopefully next year things will be back to normal and we'll be able to resume the camps up there. But Holbrook is also offering a camp at the end of the summer. We're having a nice little get together with our folks and inviting everyone to come out and join us up at Hog Island next August 28th to September 1st. And Lindsay will send the link out to that as well. But we hope you can join us next summer. We're very excited about it. So yes, there are quite a few questions, so I better get to that. The first one that I also was wanting to ask is, how long do puffins live?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like a lot of seabirds, they are relatively long-lived, especially for their size. Puffins are not that big. It's smaller than a football. And the longest record we have for any of our birds in Maine is 36 years old.
Wow.
There probably are individuals that live a bit longer than that. And probably they average 20 to 30 years old is common. So really amazing that a small bird, a relatively small bird like that, has such a long life.
Well, okay, that's pretty long. They are very small. And I wanted to mention one thing too, that my other question is when are the puffins going to be there at Hog Island, Maine? And I know part of the answer, but I'm going to let you answer it. But I just wanted to mention too that our program the puffins will probably be gone back out to sea at the time of our program, but there will be plenty of other seabirds there for us to see. Plus, we're going to learn a lot more about the project and how you might contribute by going there. But the question then is, when can they be seen at this area of Maine?
Right. Yeah. So puffins start coming back to their nesting islands in Maine in May and often early May, and they are still around to the middle of August pretty reliably. But kind of the peak activity is June and July, but you can still see individual birds in May and in at least the first half of August.
Okay, sounds good. The next one I have here is, what is the science behind making the decoys work? And does anything work given one leg works for puffins, or are there strict guidelines? Does anything work? I guess it doesn't matter if they have one leg or two, but I guess the reason they only have one is because of ease of mounting them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So puffins and terns and albatross and the other birds that are attracted using these techniques really rely on decoys as signals, often from the air, or in the puffin's case, if they're floating on the water off the island, that's when they'll see decoys on the island and think that it's a safe place and an okay place for them to check out. And so they're most important from a bit of a distance, and they don't need to be perfect replicas. The birds are they are birds. They're not artists. They're not. Once they land amongst decoys, they will often attempt to interact or get a decoy to respond to them. But they pretty quickly realize that these decoys aren't the real thing.
It's a piece of work.
And yeah, and often we'll see birds that will spend a few minutes or maybe 10, 15 minutes, half an hour among decoys. But if they don't get any other stimulus, they'll fly off thinking this wasn't real. What really helps in in the case of keeping birds at a place, is recordings of their calls. And this is especially true for the more vocal species like terns or albatross or gulls. And the calls are really the stimulus that will hold a bird in an area. And they'll accept that as much more real. I mean, the recording quality of the calls is typically quite good. And so that's a really powerful stimulus, social stimulus. And that will keep them in a place until another bird lands or another few birds land. And then there's, real live birds that can interact with one another. And once you've hit critical mass with enough birds, that they'll find each other and connect and form pair bonds, then the decoys and sound systems are superfluous. We don't need them anymore.
So do you take them off at that time then, or do you just leave them there?
We typically leave them there. There is, I shouldn't say they're totally superfluous. There is some advantage because they suggest a lot of birds. They strengthen.
Oh, it makes it seem like there's more birds there. I see what you mean. That makes sense.
So for birds that are flying over or something, they're like even more attracted. For birds that are on the ground, they pretty much ignore the decoys after there are real birds.
Okay.
So for the birds that are settling in, it becomes superfluous. But for new birds that are coming, it can still add to the attraction.
Great. Well, we have quite a few more questions here, so I'm going to try to speed things up here. So are birds that nest on islands more susceptible to extinction than birds that nest on the mainland? I mean, you mentioned that about the sea level rise, but probably for many of those same reasons, I would imagine.
Yeah, the big vulnerability of species on islands is that often they've not evolved with predators. And that means they haven't evolved to us and the hunting or the other things we do. And they haven't evolved to coexist with the species we bring with us.
Right, like those rats.
The rats, mice, cats, and such. So that's the biggest special problem or unique problem that species on islands have. Other than that, the extinction risk is really dependent on what we do in a place. The biggest way we cause extinction is to eliminate habitat, and we certainly do a lot of that on mainland continental areas as well.
As climate warms, will puffins have to nest further north, or is that not such an issue? Sea level, I mean, I'm assuming temperature of the ocean is a factor in their success as well.
Yeah. The biggest challenge with climate change for puffins isn't the air temperature. Like you say, they can tolerate a bit warmer air temperatures, but it's really what's going on in the water that matters. And most importantly, what's going on with their food. And a lot of the fish that puffins eat are challenged by climate change and either move northward or move further offshore to kind of stay in the cool water that they prefer. And for puffins nesting on islands closer to shore, if they have to go farther offshore to get food to bring back to their chicks, it makes it significantly more work to raise chicks. And we've seen that in some years in Maine already. We've seen what we're calling marine heat waves that may last for a few weeks, or one has come through that lasted for a couple of years. And in those periods, puffins have had a really hard time finding enough good food for their chicks. So that's how we think climate change will impact puffins. We are concerned about their long-term viability in Maine. So we're doing everything we can to protect their islands and kind of eliminate other problems that they have or can have, other challenges. Like we have people out on the islands to shoo away predators. We're trying to limit vegetation growing and clogging up the crevices that they like. So we're trying to mitigate. So of the effects of climate change. And we're also trying to work with fisheries managers to make sure that we can do as best we can to make sure there's enough fish, small fish out there for puffins to eat.
What is the puffin's gestation period? How long does it take for the, I mean, once they lay the egg, I guess that's what the question is how long does it take for the egg to hatch?
Yeah, puffins actually are somewhat unique that their reproductive process is slow. They don't get in a big rush. The egg takes 4 or 5 weeks to hatch, and that's not that out of the ordinary for a bird this size. But the chicks can take much longer to grow up to full size. And a normal amount of time is 5 or 6 weeks. But we've seen, and it's a possible adaptation to climate change, that in years when the adults, the parents, are having a hard time finding enough fish, they kind of slow down how much they're feeding the chick. The chick grows slower, but as long as they keep feeding the chick enough to keep it alive, when fish come back and get more available, they can recover. And so they can take as much as 10 weeks to raise a chick. So there's some flexibility in how long they can do that, how long they can spend, and that may be an important adaptation to climate change going forward.
Good. Well, so they are adaptable, and seems like it depends. Well, we have 2 more quick questions I hope we can squeeze in because we're just about out of time. Are the decoys available for purchase, and what volunteer opportunities are available for older adults?
Yeah. So puffins are available for sale. There is a Project Puffin online store. If you go to the Project Puffin website, there'll be a link, I think it's in the upper right, that you can go visit the store and purchase decoys for individual use or enjoyment. And then volunteer opportunities, I would encourage you to check out the Hog Island website. We have a lot of volunteer opportunities around our camp. And then we actually offer a Road Scholar class, a class at the camp through the Road Scholar program, which is a service program that combines both some education and some service. And in our case, we call the class Saving Seabirds. And we go out and do some habitat work on Seabird Islands in Maine where we're working. So that would be another example for say, retired age folks.
Well, terrific. I know Lindsay's going to be saying, okay, time to wrap up. I can just hear you saying it. But oh my gosh, thank you so much, Dawn. That was really educational, and really appreciate you coming on today. And I, you know, in the chat here, question and answer, there were several thank yous for this presentation and being so informative. We really appreciate all of y'all attending as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation and for everyone's attention. A lot of fun today.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Before we wrap up, real quick, I'll just mention our next webinar is scheduled for 2 weeks from today, Wednesday, October 21st. It'll be the same time, 4 p.m. on the East Coast and 1 p.m. on the West Coast. We'll be joined by some representatives from the airline industry, specifically Delta and LATAM Airlines, to talk a little bit about what the future of air travel might look like for passengers and some of the safety measures that we can expect when we return to the skies. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. We'll be sending out some information closer to that date. You can also find recordings of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel or on the Holbrook website. And again, today's presentation has been recorded, and we'll be emailing out the link to that recording along with the links that Dawn mentioned. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up our presentation today. Thank you again so much to Dr. Lyons for sharing your expertise with us, and really interesting and informative presentation. And to all of you who joined us today, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. Have a great afternoon.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.